Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Fictitious Dark. I'm Josiah, and I'm here with my co-host Rick,
Rick, nice to meet you guys. Hello, hello, hello.
and we have a special guest with us here. Our first guest, I believe.
It is. It is
Yeah,
our first guest.
you were the inaugural guest on the Fictitious Dark,
That's pretty sick.
and you've come on board for a very complicated and very specific project that you proposed that we do. It was kind of on my radar as far as true crime stuff goes, but you proposed some conspiracy theories that we are definitely going to want you to speak on because they are trending on TikTok and Year of Our Lord 2024, Jack the Ripper being a guy who paints ballerinas.
So they say.
So they say. Um, I think to begin with, I think what would be best is if we all maybe discuss what our, let's say, our general familiarity is with the Ripper case. Rick, like, what's your kind of understanding of it and going into
Well,
this podcast?
before I did any research, this past week, the only Jack the Ripper stuff I knew was from the movie From Hell.
Oh.
And the whole idea of that maybe a certain prince might be Jack the Ripper himself. And From Hell basically touches up on that. So that's basically all I knew from Jack the Ripper. I knew he killed people. What he looked like to me was this like, old Victorian style of hat with the whole, cape and everything,
Mm-hmm.
mysterious, dressed in all black, maybe a gentlemanly man, if that's such a word. But not very much. Like I didn't know that he wasn't as prolific as I thought he was. You
Mm-hmm.
know, depending on who you talk to, he might be you know a killer within just 1 month or 2 months or so. That's pretty much all I knew at the time. So, how
Mm.
about you guys? What did you guys know about Jack the Ripper?
Going into it, I was aware that he was kind of considered one of our first big serial killers. I mean, the other one being H.H. Holmes, about
Hmm.
50 years later, was kind of the next big major serial killer to kind of kick off that trend in the 20th century. But other than that, I knew that he stalked women in London and that his victims were primarily prostitutes. Other than that, like honestly, even going into it prior to research, I didn't even know how small a pool of potential victims there were. I had assumed he'd killed a lot more people, and so I was really surprised when there's only about 5 canonical victims and maybe up to about 13 suspected.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, yeah. It's just crazy how like such this serial killer that's like in our zeitgeist that we probably as little kids is like the first killer that we hear about, and we talk about it and we're like, oh, Jack the Ripper, oh, Jack the Ripper this, Jack the Ripper that, and it's like compared to the standards that we have now for you know serial killers that happened in the last like 30, 40 years. He has a very, very small list of people that he's been that he has his canonical killings.
Yeah,
um how,
yeah. I
how about you,
think
Josiah?
the
What
the
do you
only
think?
the only person I can think who comes close to the notoriety of being uh, uncaught, is probably Zodiac.
Hmm.
Because the only other one I could think of, BTK, he did get caught, and he was similar, where he didn't have like that many victims, but he spread his out over a long like decades, whereas the Jack the Ripper seems to have confined himself to a small period of time.
Yeah, in
Um,
I
just
think at
one small
most,
area too of
yeah.
a
mm-hmm.
city.
I mean, I think at most, even with like suspected victims, it would fall in about a 3 year window.
Hmm.
Which, yeah, when you look at some of these other characters we're dealing with throughout history, like, I mean, even Ted Bundy was what, like almost a decade of
Yeah,
of
because
murders before he was caught over like a span of like 3 to 5 states.
Yeah.
he went to different states and then had different kind of sprees. And this is unless we want to get into it, this is the first thing we've covered on the podcast that is pretty solidly in the true crime
Yeah.
area and not the supernatural. Although you mentioned From Hell, a lot of From Hell is about how the murders are part of this occult ritual to have him Well, his motive is to become like a god, but it
Mhm.
is to cover up these things. So
Yeah.
it is tangentially related to what we've covered so far.
Mhm. So I think all that's left to start out with is just to talk about like his like MO,
Mm-hmm.
get started with like the whole idea, and I'll start talking about his MO. The canonical five that he that are known to be Jack the Ripper murders, all have deep slash wounds to the throat, usually two, and they penetrate or not penetrate. They cut all the way to the spine, and they're followed by extensive abdominal and genital mutilation. And there's removal of organs that sometimes are placed above a shoulder or another shoulder, depending on each crime scene. And coming to the last two, I believe, is the last two of the Ripper's victims. He was starting to do facial mutilation at the end.
Yeah.
And I believe that was with Catherine Eddowes and Mary Jane Kelly that he started doing that with, or maybe it wasn't those two. Maybe it was Annie Chapman. That's where I get confused because
No, no,
we have.
it was Catherine and Mary Kelly.
Okay.
Yeah, because Mary Kelly was the one who was murdered in her apartment, I believe.
Yeah,
And that
and
was
she
by
was the
far the
one
most
that
horrific.
Yeah.
that was pretty much beyond recognition. Her
Yeah.
face was torn up. Um,
When
There's a
I,
lot of
so should we?
there's a lot of conspiracy theories about that the her being mutilated beyond repair. Perhaps it wasn't her, and she got away somehow. There's a bunch of theories about that, but
Yeah, yeah,
I mean, I think it stands too that, I mean, the easy answer for that is that it was in the privacy of like a private residence where most of these murders occurred on the street, and so the timeline you'd have of
yeah.
like witnesses is like a much smaller window where he could have potentially had hours throughout
Mhm.
the night to like mutilate this body, which is maybe what his intention is. And since it's further down the line of murders too, a lot of times serial killers tend to escalate over time.
Yeah,
um, that's just one thought
yeah.
I have.
And I believe one of them he was disturbed while he was just beginning
That was the
his usual dealing.
two
that's
night
the
attack,
yeah
right?
the double event. He started and he only got the slashes done, and
Yeah.
because he was possibly disturbed, he still had that killing urge in him. And I wanted to talk to about this is that Katie and I calculated this. Given the time of death, the double event, he would have had to, if he's walking, it's 12 minutes. And let's say he's running, like 9-10 minutes, and he has to kill the next woman and
Within
mutilate her within like a 30-minute window.
Yeah.
So he
Um,
does both of these within like 30 minutes of each other.
yeah, and I know one of the police reports, I think it was the coroner or whatever they call them over there in England. They said that a lot of the damage that was done is done within like 5 minutes of him
Mm-hmm.
doing the initial throw slash. So
wow.
he works pretty dang quick because he knows that he has a very short amount of time, especially doing it in public. And I believe like the first couple of bodies he left like on door like public
Uh-huh.
doorsteps.
Yeah.
Um,
And that kind of brings up the question then too. A lot of people say like, "Oh, his work was too shoddy to be like a surgeon or something."
Mm.
But the fact that he did all of this within such a small frame of time, as well as the fact that he not only mutilated several parts of the body, but he specifically like cut out and stole certain organs, like
mhm.
the letter from hell, he sent a piece of a kidney, he removed several uteruses, he took, was it Mary Kelly, he took her heart,
Yeah.
I believe so.
along with like disemboweling them. So like he had some kind of anatomical familiarity at the very least.
I mean,
Yeah.
aside from the last one, Mary Kelly, they had that thing where her clothes were burned, and they theorized that maybe he did that to create light so he could do his work. Because this is something else you have to realize is like the streets weren't as well lit as they are now. So
Mhm.
some of these mutilations he's doing in very dark environments, and so when someone says, "Oh yeah, it wasn't like professional grade work," like surgically, I'm like, well, most
Perform surgery
surgeons,
with a blindfold. Let's see what
yeah,
you do.
he's performing surgery at night, and he doesn't have all the time in the world. Whereas a surgeon, like if someone's dissecting a corpse, they have like a nice like lifted table. There's good lighting. They have
Surgical grade
time.
equipment as
You know,
well.
they have like more
Yeah.
equipment, and like the fact that a lot of there's critics of that theory that they're like, oh, he doesn't really have any knowledge. I think that's preposterous. He had to have had like some skill
Yeah.
at organ removal.
And the thing is, like, he wasn't using a scalpel or any, sharp item. He's using a penknife, which is basically like a modern day pocket knife,
Mm.
which, those have very, very thick blades. They're gonna be really, really rough to cut with.
Mm-hmm.
And when you're dealing with a person like this, that, some reports have that, he could have been, you know, this could have been like a sexual fantasy, almost like a sexual thing for him. And, he probably started off cutting, and as he got into it more, he was a little bit more rougher with it and not thinking, but feeling and feeling all of that, almost a, eroticism that, he's getting off of it. And it's almost like people don't understand that, it's not going to be like tight little cuts like you guys are saying, like perfect surgeon. He's doing something to for a different meaning instead of trying to like help someone or repair something. He's trying to mutilate. He's trying to get off on this.
That's a good point too,
Um,
especially considering that all the victims are prostitutes, because this is a marginalized group of people that you know to kind of put it in modern perspective, like when we look at like human trafficking, a lot of times it's marginalized groups of
yeah.
people because if they go missing, people are less likely to go looking. But as well, with being prostitutes, there is that level of like sexualization already involved with this person
hmm
just by being a human being.
Yeah. And let's just talk about the general area, the Victorian England where they live, Whitechapel. It was an overpopulated area that was poor,
Mm-hmm.
that relied on lots of prostitution. There was a lot of immigrants from other countries. Um, there was like a lot of you know, rich, well-to-do people that looked down on that area that came into that area for prostitution as
Yeah.
well. So, uh, it just kind of reminds me, like, nowadays we look at like all these like inner city places and we look down on them, and there's a lot of murders and a lot of things that go on. You know, Jack the Ripper wasn't really the only serial killer that was happening during that whole time. There was, I believe, like the torso
The
killer,
torso
and
killer.
Mm-hmm.
yeah, and there's one other one I can't remember right now. Um, but there's a lot going on there, and it's almost like it could have been rich people coming in doing all these murders, maybe to scare off the immigrants to go back to where they were going to, or maybe something else if you believe
Oh,
other theories.
so an act of gentrification.
Exactly.
Interesting.
Almost a crazy version of gentrification. That,
Yeah.
well,
That's actually an
I,
interesting point, though, because I lived in New York for over a year, and there's waves in New York with like the safety and the crime levels and like different neighborhoods being like gentrified versus being reclaimed by their initial cultural groups. And as I was moving out, there was a lot of increased rates of crime, and it was starting to mimic a lot of the crime waves of the 70s, where in which the city was overpopulated, it was overrun
hmm
with crime and a lot of homelessness and prostitution. And there was actually several women. There was a serial killer, the Times Square killer, during the 70s, who was
Mm.
taking prostitutes and murdering them and leaving them in hotel rooms. And this does kind of mirror that a little bit.
yeah, and I think a lot of it kind of just has to deal with, like, people are so poor, and they're trying to get, like, you know almost like get themselves, further themselves, but then they're stuck in a way that they can't even push themselves, to get higher in the social ladder, that, they feel like they have to literally like step on the next person to get above. And this is like the next extreme, that we are talking about, is like, killing the people, killing your own neighbors. We're even seeing a part of that right now in what's going on in Israel and Palestine. Um, it's kind of like a crazy, like, sick world that we have sometimes when people are pushed together, overpopulated, groups of people that don't understand each other's cultures. One culture might do something that might be disrespectful to another culture, and then vice versa. And it just kind of like exaggerates all these emotions and everything, and it just kind of leads to a crest and an apex where violence is the only answer that they can find. You know,
And that's an interesting
uh,
point too, because a lot of the immigrants in Whitechapel at the time were primarily Irish and Jewish. And I
Hmm.
know at the scene of after one of the murders, I can't remember which woman it was, but like her apron went missing, and they found it like halfway down the block in front of a building, and it was like bloodied up and thrown at the
Yeah.
foot of like a chalk graffiti on the wall that was like essentially like Jew blaming. Um,
Yeah, it was like Jewel. It was even spelt right. It was like Julius or something like that. I can't remember.
Juwe, I think.
yeah.
Yeah.
And there was that one guy, Pizer, who got picked up
Hmm.
as a potential Ripper victim, and he was cleared. But that's where that leather apron name came from.
Yeah.
Going
Because
on,
he's a butcher, or not butcher. He was a what was he?
Oh.
I have it written down. He was a certain.
while you're getting that, I wanted to make a quick comment about that earlier line about people who are desperate.
Yeah.
Um, if you're desperate enough, if a John comes to you and says, "Look, I want to do this, but how about I pay you a little extra? I just can't do it without having a knife to your throat."
Yeah.
And then like it's like, well, he like preps you ahead of time. He's like, like, don't worry. It's like it's just a weird thing. I just need to do it. I'll pay you like double. And of course
Yeah.
he's gonna kill them. He's not gonna pay them the double. But people who
Yeah.
are desperate are gonna agree to like ridiculous things like that people in like a more secure environment are not going to agree to. And under it, they'll go like, no, I don't think we're gonna do it with the knife out. And he'll go, no, I really like,
Well,
you know,
and another thing to note, because, we were talking a bit about, researching some of these women's lives, which could be a whole spin-off, is just
That's
talking
a
about
Yeah.
their backgrounds.
that's a
But
whole episode. Yeah,
not only were they pretty much all, if not all, prostitutes, a lot of them were widows and divorcees who had children.
Mhm.
And so again, like that ups the ante of desperation when you are a single parent trying to support a family. And I think the statistic in Whitechapel during the 1880s was 50% of children didn't live past 5 years old.
Yeah.
well, I do want to state that in a lot of these situations, the women, some of them abandoned their families, or some of them left their children with their parents. And then in a lot of cases, they were divorcees, and the husbands had either thought they were cheating, or there was one case where the guy thought she was prostituting already, probably because she wanted her own wealth, private wealth, and so then he refused to like pay the settlement and the child payments and that kind of stuff. So there's a lot of desperation, and it's a sad story that is repeated across like all the what we know of the canonical five and the other women too. Is that I really made a point of this time around to read all of their stories and not focus just on the fact they were killed by Jack. It's just that Jack
Mhm.
was the sad, like twisted ending to the tragedy that was their lives, really, because they were all like boozing it up and could barely make
Yeah.
their rent and uh,
Yeah.
just very very sad, really.
Yeah. So the two things that we were I was looking up to.
Pizer,
It
yeah,
says Jewess are the men that will not be blamed for nothing, and
yeah,
it's called the Colston Street Graffito, and then it was Catherine Eddowes apron, and third thing was uh, Pizer was a shoe cobbler. He was a
Mhm.
so he had a leather apron that was
yeah.
associated with that. Um, so you were
And
and
it
there's
is.
one.
It's partially because of the surgical kind of knowledge, but it is interesting to me that, like you were saying, Rick, is that the common conception of like the mental image of Jack the Ripper is as the guy in the top hat, like the refined gentleman. Even if you
Hmm.
don't believe in the conspiracy theories, that's kind of the mental image. And I think that's the thing, is that when you look at Jack the Ripper, it's almost like we've all been talking about it. He's the embodiment of the secretive class warfare,
Hmm.
the uh, disgust, or
Yeah.
the fantasies being enacted on people who won't be missed,
Hmm.
is a common kind of scenario in a lot of these cases. I was talking to Katie earlier about Green River. Yeah, I think I mentioned earlier, Green River Killer is another one who preyed primarily, pretty much exclusively, on prostitutes.
Yeah. Yeah,
Something.
because these are people that some deem as like the lowest social social rung of our society, if they go missing, no one's going to care, So they go for something that they can get their little thrill, their thing that they want to do completed, and then they can get away scot free because no one's going to be looking for these women, or sometimes men.
Mm-hmm.
We had what's it called? Wasn't it the lady that from the movie Monsters?
Oh,
It was like I want to say Marlene, but that's not right.
Yeah.
shoot, yeah, she,
Um,
Woodrose.
I-
Eileen
Eileen.
Woodrose.
Eileen Woodrose, yeah,
Uh,
you
yeah,
know,
she was the rare reverse.
yeah, where she killed the males, and she was doing it almost out of desperation because she was needing money for her and her partner.
Mm-hmm.
When a lot of her crimes also centered around luring them in through prostitution as well, which is funny to
Yeah.
see the reverse of this, where it's
Yeah,
now prostitution
yeah,
is being used as a lure rather than as like a point to be taken advantage of. It's taking advantage of somebody else.
yeah,
That's a whole episode. Eileen is very fascinating because again, it's
yeah.
like with these kinds of people who do this stuff, it's hard to know sometimes what if their justifications are legit. Like,
Hmm.
how much was them just needing to make ends meet, and how much was revenge or like other psychological factors.
Yeah.
But Eileen is very fascinating and a rare. Pretty much her and who's the one woman who chopped people up? I don't remember.
Lizzie Borden, I think.
Lizzie
Yeah.
Was
Borden.
it?
Thank you.
Yeah.
But again, that one's different because it was familial murder, not anything that
Well,
was
yeah.
to do with like sexual gratification, which is usually where the serial killers
Yeah.
fall in.
Hmm.
Because I think we can all agree is that yeah, there is an eroticism at play here. Um, the there are those who say, well, we can't know that he received gratification, and there was no evidence that he had sex with them necessarily, but yeah, the just the increasing viciousness. Like by the time you get to the Mary Kelly in the house where she's like in the 90 or whatever, like he's progressed to full on not even like frenzy. He's like breaking the woman down to like her components. He's like
Yeah.
completely removing like all that makes her a human or a woman. He's trying to dissect the woman down to her parts.
It's like the most
Yeah.
brutish form of objectification when it comes down to it. Like, you're just a body, you're not a person. Which also is interesting in the fact that as his murders escalated, and he started removing organs, primarily the organs he focused on taking pieces of were uteruses. One case, there was her ovaries were removed and one was left at the scene. And then oftentimes parts of their vagina, and as well as just being genitally mutilated.
Yeah.
Again, leans into the idea that this might have been somewhat sexually tethered.
Yeah.
And I mean,
And
I
even
don't think it's a stretch. I'd like to know what you think, Rick, but I think it's not a stretch to say that he's doing this because he's not able to find satisfaction in the traditional sexual act.
definitely, it seems like it's almost that like certain thing where he might have been into some like S&M type stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And as when he got further along, that just didn't do it for him anymore. And you can tell with each of the killings, and even some of them that he was supposedly responsible for that were earlier than the canonical five. If you add those in, each of them, just rev up on the intensity of what he's doing. Where I think the first one, he basically like beat her with like a blunt object, and um for her abdomen with like the blunt object as well by sticking it in, where um but it just shows like just like a person that's just like they don't know how to get this release or this like almost like what's the word, like relief of what they're looking for.
Yeah.
And as they went on, it just got worse and worse and worse. So it makes you think that these canonical five, when he got to the last one, and then the following I think it was like three more murders, where they were not quite the same. It makes you think, okay, this is a totally different person that's doing this because it's not part of the
Yeah.
initial 5 where it ramped up.
True, it doesn't fit the pattern.
Yeah.
Well, and something I do agree. Something that I do want to keep in mind is that this guy, he was ramping up, but with the double event, he was interrupted. He's like he just had to leave it with a throat cut. So
Yeah.
he isn't so blatant that he needs to like go as far as he does with Mary Kelly. And Mary Kelly, he has a secluded home. He has privacy. So he saw an opportunity and he took it. So this guy is highly opportunistic.
Which
Yeah.
also makes you wonder too, if he was the torso killer, was the body mutilated elsewhere and then moved to the site where it was found?
Mhm.
That would, if it was, I think you mentioned earlier, like his private residence, that would give you
Yeah.
a lot of time to do what you want to do and then just relocate it.
Well, so I don't want to go too like controversial, but we did bring up human trafficking. But the sick thing is that we find these killings that happen and they find the bodies. But if you're rich and powerful enough, you take someone to like a private residence, you have a certain setup, no one's ever gonna find them, or you have the time to do the more extreme things and then discard the remains. Of course, back
Very
then,
true.
their forensic technology was extremely limited.
Yeah.
Um,
So it also makes you think that, that back in the day we didn't really I should say they didn't really have the the technology to keep an eye on people and to know people's whereabouts. So it makes you think of like maybe Mary Kelly or somebody else. I think it was Elizabeth Stride or no, Elizabeth Stride's the one that he got interrupted in killing.
yeah,
There's one other one where they found her in a room as well. Um, it makes you think that maybe these people were missing a lot longer than what they thought they were missing, and so maybe he had a little bit more time to do his business and not be interrupted. And just like the Mary Kelly thing, he was burning things because he was taking taking his time to ramp up to do what he was doing.
yeah,
Because like it says that there had been a recent fire severe enough to melt this solder between the kettle and the spout.
yeah.
So the fire had to be going pretty strong for a while to melt the solder off the kettle and a spout. Um, and the thing is also that I don't think we've talked about is all these murders happened at nighttime and around the weekend and the end of the month as well.
Mm-hmm.
So it makes you think of
Vacation.
vacation, uh, the weekend, that people getting
Living
off
for the
work.
weekend.
Yep, he had his weekend fun. And the third thing is, it's almost like he was something like he maybe planned during the whole week of him work when doing his normal day-to-day activities, and that was his outlet to release everything. Uh, so my big quick question for you guys is, before we get into a lot of theories and things about who we think is a killer and blah blah blah, do you believe that he was a man of the upper class, or do you think that he was another victim of like the class system of where he was probably someone of a lower social rank?
I personally have a couple potential theories I'm circling around, and I would say all of them place him at least middle class.
Middle class, okay. How about you for Josiah?
I don't. I think if we're looking at the canonical five, I would put him at middle class or above. If we're counting like Martha Tabram, who was the second, she was like stabbed 39 times, but there was no throat, no dissection. That's a very, and it was a shorter blade. That's a very
One was Martha the one that. No, it was pre Martha, wasn't it? That was reported that it was a group.
You're talking about Elizabeth.
Yeah.
Yeah, Emma
That was
Elizabeth
Emma
Smith.
Elizabeth Smith.
And that was just previous to Martha, though, in
Yeah,
chronological
that was the
order.
one where he used a blunt object.
That's right, and she died in the hospital.
Yeah.
The next day, yeah. But she reported it as a group. It could have been her pimp. It's even possible, it's unlikely, but it's even possible that perhaps some guys got together, did something messed up, and one of them went on to become Jack. But he altered, he had his own preference for how he wanted to explore his fantasies and his design, as Hannibal puts it. Um, uh, and so he went off on his own and decided to take it farther and farther and farther than what the group had done. That's possible. It's definitely possible. The only one after that I am genuinely like, this seems like it could be the same guy. Is if we go to the subsequent stuff, Rose Milet strangled, kind of hung. I don't think it's that. Alice Mackenzie.
What are you talking about, Francis Coles?
Francis Coles, I think, that one to me, just based on the fact that the knife isn't dissimilar.
Yeah.
There's nothing in here about being reported that the police are like it's a different knife. The fact that it's the two slices across the neck. She's by the railway, so he clearly like took an opportunity to do it and then get away quick. But there were no mutilations suggesting he might have been disturbed again. I think that one has the most hallmarks of the canonical five, where I could see that being the same guy. And again, since it's near the railway, perhaps there was a way he could have done it and then gotten out of there. I'm not sure. I'd have to do research into like the public transit station, because it was under a railway arch.
Yeah.
At 2:15 a.m. I don't know how late those ran, but
But there's tunnels to run into.
there is tunnels. There, so that one to me, I think very strongly, I suspect that might be the same guy. And Katie and I have talked about what became, is it possible for a killer to reduce their urges and just kind of cease after like a 2-month period? We know with BTK he was able to hold off for decades, but Jack could have gone and killed people elsewhere, or he could have, again, if he found a good setup, he could have found a better way. He decided to start hiding the bodies because
two of the biggest theories for why he went uncaught were that he died shortly after the last one, or that he left either the city or the country, which I also have a theory about if he emigrated as well.
So before we go into theories, one last thing I want to touch about is last couple of months I read this book that was about horror, the general idea of horror, and it went through the different centuries, decades, and how horror has changed over time. During Victorian era horror, a lot of the stuff that was written was based on the poor public being scared of the aristocrats. That's where we got our Dracula,
Dr. Jekyll.
And so,
which, if you think about, was playing in 1886, which is
so
around the time this all cropped up.
That one actor was so good at playing Mr. Hyde and Dr. Jekyll that people thought he was Jack the Ripper.
Yep.
It's kind of interesting. Yeah, you're right. The aristocrat.
There's a level of propaganda being placed into culture already that mirrors Jack the Ripper.
Yeah. And so the whole idea is, where one of my arguments that it might not be a person of high status, is because usually a lot of these crimes and murder, serial killers, are not people of a high class. They're usually middle class America or middle class, stature, and that is their way to almost stand out in the rest of the, world. They're usually stuck at one level, and they don't know any way but be average. It's always the average man, average looking guy. There's a few exceptions, your Ted Bundys, which some women say is gorgeous or beautiful looking. There's few exceptions, but back in the day, going back on the idea that, you know, the poor were afraid of the rich. Could have this been like some kind of maybe like some journalism story where why we believe Jack the Ripper, the first idea that, I thought of was, the well-to-do man in the top hat and, cape with a cane and everything like that. Is that to do with just the whole idea of what horror was back then, and it's been, passed on throughout generations, and that's the idea that people that don't do research normally have because, you know, even for example, From Hell kind of
Right.
pushes on that whole idea, and that's like almost the easiest access to Jack the Ripper if you're not doing research too.
Because the thesis of From Hell, the graphic novel, is that Jack the Ripper creates the 20th century through his rituals. So all the serial killers that follow him are like imprinted by his evil. And so potentially, yeah, is like, what if you're right, is that these serial killers who are usually middle class, they're almost like they have this, it's almost like the idea of how, there was that period in the 90s where there was the sensationalization of like true crime, and even today, like you look at
Yeah.
the high consumption level of true crime content, we're very like fascinated and intrigued, and a lot of these killers, yeah, they see themselves as they have this complex where they need to like be validated by being above everyone or being different than
They need to be
everyone.
seen.
They need to be seen, and so maybe this idea of what Jack the Ripper like represented, but he was kind of fiction made manifest. And as we all know, like the thing about art imitates life isn't quite true. Art is life, life is art. And so perhaps Jack the Ripper was literally like someone creating something, like creating the fiction into reality, and then it was so powerful, like it was such a powerful in a way like a ritual, like the murders cemented this fiction, this idea of this like well-to-do, like um educated, refined, artistic murderer. And so then subsequently all these killers have like subconsciously wanted to become that.
Yeah. It's almost like the like picturesque model that has been built for them, and they're like, ooh,
Mm-hmm.
that's how I have to be.
Yeah.
I can't be hot. My my presence has to precede me, or everybody has to be scared of me or know me, in a sense. So
That does
I,
bring up
I
a
definitely can see that. I can definitely agree that, if it's like any other thing in the world, if a person aspires to be something, the first thing they do is they look up who their favorite is
Mm-hmm. Right.
on that thing, and they aspire to be that person. And as they go on beginning their, ascent to what they're doing, that's when they get the little bit of their personality and a little bit of, things that they add into it that makes it their own.
Their design.
So, yeah, their design.
Yeah.
So it makes you think, was he the archetype that started it all?
And that does bring up a good point, because you look at like with each person, like if for example a theory was that he was one of the group who attacked the first woman and was like, there's things we can do better, I've learned from this scenario.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Then you could look forward again 50 years at somebody like H.H. Holmes, who then built a hotel essentially with like booby traps to hide his murders, to hide his victims in the walls, to have secret rooms where he could, torture people. And so again, looking at Jack the Ripper, he's like, I like what he did here, but it was out in the street and he didn't have a lot of privacy or places to do things. Like, I'm gonna do it better.
Yeah.
And
It makes you wonder.
I do.
There's always a one-upsmanship too.
Yeah.
Well, because that's the thing about serial killers, is that with rare exceptions, none of them would ever admit they were inspired by another killer. A lot of them, there is the one-upsmanship. There is the thing
There's a
of
level
like,
of dominance within serial killing itself that
Yeah.
I think lends itself to needing to be the top dog or be the most infamous killer of all
like
time.
like Manson was like, there was that one interview where he's shitting on Bundy, calling him like a poop head and shit like that. It's like,
Oh my God.
it's so weird. Like, he's like, yeah, he's so like he's such an idiot, and it's like so it's sometimes you'll encounter them where they do correspond or they do speak favorably.
Yeah.
But yeah, I do think that that idea of the one-upsmanship, and then even now, like if you're a killer nowadays and you're trying to become like this god, you're not gonna say
Yeah.
like I was inspired by reading Jack the Ripper novels. Like you
Yeah.
just sound like a fool. But
Yeah.
it could be up here. You're trying to
Hmm.
create your own.
I'm
Yeah.
trying to
And
remember.
another thing that, like, I don't know if this is true and I'm just generalizing things, but in it seems like most of the serial killers that I've read about or I've known just a little bit about, most of them are submissive people in their day-to-day everyday life. And then when it comes to them doing their thing, that's when they get to become the dom.
Mm-hmm.
So it makes you think, that they're almost weak until it comes to the point where they have all the power, where
Yeah.
they, you know, position themselves into getting that to that point where they are in total control, where
Yeah.
normally they're not in control of anything.
Right. The control is at the heart of it always, because the any and a lot of times it does have the sexual component, and that's what it comes down to, is you are insufficient or not confident sexually, and that repressed energy has this rejection, this murderous rage that can build in some of these guys. And
Yeah.
yeah, when they have total control, then they're comfortable. They have that relief, but they can't yield that control to anyone. They can't have a true union or partnership, because they're incapable of it.
Yeah.
Something to circle back a little bit with the idea of
Mhm.
killers inspiring each other and the trickle down effect. I don't know if you guys have heard about this. I watched this documentary on Netflix a couple years ago, and this just reminded me. There was during the 70s and 80s a serial killer in the UK that was titled like the Yorkshire Ripper or the modern Jack
Mm-hmm.
the Ripper. And I believe
Yeah.
he murdered like 13 women, mostly prostitutes,
Mm-hmm.
within like a 20-mile radius. And he was sentenced to like I don't even know how many like counts of life in prison, and he just died like a couple years ago. But he
Mm-hmm.
essentially was inspired by Jack the Ripper and was like one of the few to openly admit like this was my inspiration for what I did, which I think is rather fascinating. That
Yeah.
it all goes back to Jack the Ripper.
Yep. It always goes back to the original,
Yeah. The grandpappy.
the grandpappy,
Which is
the
funny.
daddy.
murder.
Which is funny because again we have this torso murderer operating at the same time, and that's arguably even more. Well, I guess that last one
Gruesome.
that Jack did was
Pretty
pretty
bad.
pretty extreme, but the torso one
Yeah.
is so, because again, Scotland Yard was built on the crime scene where they found that torso. They found it
Yeah.
in the basement. Like that's the in a way that's like even more haunting. Like, oh, this institution of law and order was the site of like a horrific dismemberment and disposal. Like.
Well, and something that's fascinating with that timeline is you had the torso killings happening in the late, 18, what was it, like 1880,
1880s.
late 1880s. But then there was counts in 1891 of a woman in Manhattan who was killed in almost the exact same fashion, and the records of like her death and like all of the court cases and everything are almost identical to the way that all of it was handled in the UK, which makes you wonder if there was somebody like not saying this, but if you had someone who works in law enforcement per se, who has an inside in, you know, is it possible
There's a
they could
couple of
get
movies
things?
that are like that.
What's that?
There's a couple of movies that have something to do with something like that.
Yeah, I mean, it makes you wonder. I won't go into details, but my mom used to work for law enforcement back in the 90s, and she had a coworker who, within like 6 months of her being hired, was arrested because he killed his wife, and they found her body like in a really, really terrible way in his garage and stuff, and it was covered up by one of his coworkers who knew and stuff. So
Yeah.
these things do happen, and it makes you wonder.
It's like the whole idea of they have the power to, suppress that,
Yeah,
and they're able to deflect everything by them being part of that law enforcement. It's
exactly.
almost one of the things that, people get upset about law enforcement.
And a
that
lot of
they're
it,
able to suppress what they want and,
exactly.
you know,
And a lot
kind
of
of
it comes
deal.
down to like improper record keeping because I was Carrie Brown is the one who was the torso murder in Manhattan in 1891, and I read a big report on someone who was studying her murder, and essentially they were saying it goes back to a lot of the same issues with the Ripper cases and the torso murders and these things happening in the same time, is that there's little to no paper trail.
Hmm.
Like law enforcement totally butchered their job, which is funny because in the Yorkshire Ripper case in
The dog.
the 70s
Yorkshire
and 80s,
Terrier case.
terrible dog. It's like Cujo. But in the 70s and 80s, that was the same problem. Is law enforcement was going around trampling on each other's evidence, and
Yeah.
this guy got away with how many murders because they were essentially either bumbling idiots or covering somebody's trail.
Yeah, and you know, in the early or late 1880s, you know, probably forensics wasn't something that was very, very known at that time. You know, they didn't know how important it could be to solve cases. You know, and I think a lot of this um, evidence was like lost. You know, during the Jack the Ripper killings,
Oh
and
yeah.
that's why they have like no idea. You know, modern DNA wouldn't even help, or modern like forensics wouldn't even help at this point. You know,
Yeah.
because you know there's one suspect that they found with DNA, but it was a certain type of DNA, I think mitochondrial DNA,
Yeah.
that is used to rule people out of things, not to
Oh.
implicate them because so many people have relatable DNA of that sort. So it just makes you think that maybe like if you weren't safe, they weren't the bubbling you know detectives that we see from like certain like comedy films, that if maybe we'd be able to see who Jack the Ripper was, or
And
find out, I should say.
and even in that same regard, the graffito on the wall, it's documented. It's basically hearsay because there's talks about it, but immediately the police chief was like, "Wash it away. We don't want to cause
Right.
like disruption in society." So there's
Yeah.
like I don't know. I mean, I think at that time they had some crude camera equipment and stuff, but there's no photographs. There's no like written documentation of like a
Hmm.
police report. It's just kind of hearsay from people who saw it.
He
Yeah,
wanted
and
to avoid the riot, and so he was like, take this down immediately. You know.
and who's to say that the graffiti wasn't already up, and our friend Mr. Ripper didn't just deposit the apron there and then to make it seem a certain
Exactly.
way.
Yeah.
Or it
There's no
could have been
evidence on
anyone.
that.
I mean, someone could have moved it there because they wanted Jack to be perceived as Jewish. You know, who knows?
Yeah, yeah. So it just shows you that until we get time machines to go back in time, Jack the Ripper will still remain unknown.
Yeah.
But I think this would be a good way to segue into the thing that brought this whole idea and conversation for us to talk about, the whole theory aspect. And I believe that there's one of the three of us that has a big theory they love to talk about.
Yeah,
I wonder who that is.
let's talk about it. So, as you mentioned with TikTok, this whole idea came about. I've always been fascinated by Jack the Ripper, and I've always been fascinated by like art history. And amazingly enough, the two could possibly be related. So when I was living in New York, I had the great pleasure of getting to go to the Met a lot, because it's fairly an inexpensive thing to do when you're broke and living in the city. And Degas has like a whole room devoted to like his sculptures and his sketch work and his painting of the ballet company in London. And he there's books, I know they wrote a musical about him several years ago. I got to see it at the Fifth when it premiered. It was pretty cool. But there's this whole idea that basically he was financially supporting young ballerinas who were underprivileged at the time so that they could study in the ballet corps, under the rule that they would model for him for his art. And so he had one student named, I forget her last name, I know her first name was Marie, and she's the one that's the statue of the little dancer, where she's standing kind of like stubbornly and like but he worked with her for years, as well as many other women. So a lot of artists, we know have a very intimate knowledge of anatomy. They study, you know, the internal and the external workings of bodies to understand how to portray them accurately in a visual sense. We also know that he had a fascination with the female body, specifically in studying young women. A lot of the women in the ballet corps, if they didn't make it as like prima ballerinas, became prostitutes. So we also know that that was a direct through line into that line of work. For instance, if I'm remembering correctly, Marie, who inspired the statue of the little dancer, when it was first premiered, the art scene at the time called it garish and horrible, and the ballet company actually fired her because of the statue. She was fired and became a prostitute and died, if I'm not mistaken, like 10 years later. It was really sad. But a lot of his sculptures were also, they were made of wax, which is kind of interesting. And one of them recently, they were doing some sort of work on for like repair and, you know, just keeping it in good form. And they found some DNA, like tissue, inside the like core of the statue, which also could be a weird tether of like, why is that there? I mean, maybe he was sculpting and he cut his own hand. We don't know.
Yeah.
But Jack the
that is a
Ripper
little
took
weird.
trophies.
Yeah.
And there was, yeah, little pieces of organs missing. So who knows, you know? He would have been in like kind of the middle class, but like Degas, but like touching on the upper class as well. Like he did artwork for some upper class people, so he would have had connections and like alibis. And I know he wasn't he was like an affluent man, but he wasn't a well liked man in the upper society. He didn't have a lot of social outings and stuff. And what's odd is during the period of time that the Jack the Ripper murders were happening, he actually started writing, I'm forgetting which, was it a member of parliament or somebody of influence that summer. He was writing them letters about this trip he was taking out of town. And he just in kind of an odd, peculiar way that was out of character of like, yeah, and I'm going out of town, and these are the days that I'm going to be gone, and this is where I'm going, and like outlining it to this like very specific degree. And there's theories that that was him creating his own alibi for a period of time in which these murders were occurring.
Well, and something else, I mean, it's all extremely fascinating. Rick, I want to hear your thoughts in a sec, but something else is that one of the main suspects, if you look on, you know, certain sources, is Walter Sickert, who painted Jack the Ripper's bedroom, this very, like, disturbing image of, like, what he perceives to be Jack the Ripper's world, and also painted one that was this ambiguous photo of maybe it's a guy sitting on the bed next to a dead woman, maybe he just slept with her, maybe, you know, it's very ambiguous, but it's, like, really charged. And guess who his apprentice was? Edward Degas.
No, I thought, wasn't he Degas' apprentice?
No.
I'm sure it's the other way around. I'll double check.
Uh-oh.
But the point
Double
is
check.
that, you know, we have this idea of maybe it's not someone who's necessarily, like, upper class, but an artist with aspirations of doing some great work.
Mm-hmm. To being noticed for what they're doing. You know, maybe they didn't make it as an artist, you know. On Degas too, I was looking at pictures of him, and he kind of has that normal Jack the Ripper look to him.
Yeah.
You know, kind of the like, he's like a little overweight. You know, has like the little beard. I believe one of the pictures I saw had him wearing a nice Victorian hat, and I'm like, this is pretty interesting. He kind of looks like it.
That would be the ultimate irony, that the image of him with a top hat, because that wasn't the image they had at the time. You know, a lot of the contemporary artwork, he was like this, either a phantom or like this a stocking cap wearing guy.
Yeah, like
an evil Sherlock Holmes.
Exactly. I was gonna say the sleuth hat that as I call it, is what you know was known as. I forgot like the actual term for the hat.
I think I think it's a deerstalker hat.
Yeah, deerstalker hat. Thank you. But you know, to go off even more theories, there's one that I even read that Jack the Ripper could have been Jill the Ripper. You know, she could have been or Jack the Ripper could have been her, that was a midwife that had an apron that could have been bloody all the time, because it was normal for a midwife to be bloody because of certain, births
That's
that
what
they had to
that's
do.
what Arthur Conan Doyle thought, and he wrote
Yeah.
Sherlock Holmes. So
Something else I forgot. I was
Mhm.
looking back at some Degas stuff. As he aged, his psychological well-being deteriorated very quickly, as did his eyesight, and so he began to isolate a lot socially in the last like 10 years of his life, which is like the 1890s into like the early 1910s, and he was still painting and sculpting during that time, but that could also account for like his ability to cut well, but it's appears sloppy, as like maybe again if eyesight is limited, which again would allow him to work in the dark well. He could feel things out. But also, there's been recent studies in the psychology of serial killers by doing scans on deceased serial killers that they all have the same trait of there's like in the I don't know if it's the frontal lobe, but it's like one of the front parts of the brain. There's this deterioration that's happening, and there's like almost like a spot that's just like dead tissue, and they think that may be linked to some of the psychological, like that part of the brain isn't functioning correctly, and so like murdering is like something that like kind of fills that void. But that's the same part of the brain that will deteriorate when you have this kind of vision loss. So another interesting thing that again we can't go back and like exhume his body. I don't even know where he's buried in France somewhere, but
yeah.
When I was reading like on this Dega theory, when I read this a little bit, when Josiah first brought it up to me, I wanted to read a little bit so I would know just a tiny bit, just in case I had to, talk about it as well. Some of the paintings, there's people said that there's like evidence in some of his paintings about, that there's like darkness about the ballerinas being prostitutes in them.
He painted a lot of women nude and bathing as well. Was a big
Yeah.
trend.
Which again, like that's in the art scene. It's art. You're gonna get a lot of that, but I think not just the way. Again, that one image. This is a Sickert thing, but that one ambiguous image of the guy sitting at the bed and the woman's like turned away, and it's like you can't tell, like her throat could be cut or maybe she's just asleep.
Yeah.
And this kind of sometimes the art can technically be like, oh well, that's just like a standard thing, but you look at it and you're like, I don't know, there's like some weird energy coming off this.
Yeah. Oh,
the darkness
I'm
around
looking
the
at
ballerinas.
the Sickert painting. It's almost like she's like positioned in a way where her like throat is.
Yeah.
And it is like an awkward position almost,
Mm-hmm.
And it looks like the gentleman is almost contemplating what he just did.
Yes. Yeah. And that could just be he slept with a prostitute and he's married or something, but
yeah.
But it also could be that he killed her.
Yeah.
And
then I'm looking at the Jack the Ripper bedroom one.
Bedroom one, yeah.
Yeah, it looks really, really crude.
It does. It does. Again, with the some of the only evidence, quote unquote, about the Ripper is the letters and the postcard. But the thing is that the Dear Boss letter and the Saucy Jack postcard are probably fake. And I think they have like some evidence it was done by journalists to like create a better story. But the From Hell letter is a different style, and it does have the kidney, but it does have some spelling and grammar stuff to it. So it is a little crude, but again, the argument of if something's crude or if it's not crude, but if you're smart enough, you can make something look crude.
Yeah.
So that doesn't
throw the trail off.
Yeah, that doesn't preclude it being someone like Degas or Sickert or somebody else.
But even back in those times, literacy wasn't a major thing,
Yeah.
So that doesn't rule out anybody of any class at that point, because, most people of the higher class didn't bother with any, education for the most part because they didn't need it,
Mm-hmm.
I think like education is almost like a 20th century kind of thing. It's like when it first started. And I know a lot of things in the United States where we reside, it's something that recently just started probably like in the 60s and 70s, getting better. And still there's a lot of discrepancies from living in a bigger city and private schools, and possibly to like living in the country and living in smaller towns. There's a difference in the education that we all get. So I could see it even being more of a widespread back in the day. You know, especially of probably like how Katie was saying in Whitechapel, 50% of the kids didn't live past five years old. So it was pretty rough and tough, and there was no schooling probably even done. It was
No.
it was a schooling of the streets
It's like,
that they
congrats
learned.
that you lived long enough to join the workforce.
Go work in the yard.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, go work in the yard, go work in the coal
The
mine.
coal mine. Yeah.
Yeah, go work in the ships.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Uh, but to talk more about Degas, I think he lived more in France, correct? And
His later years,
when
he
he sent
visited
that letter
London
out
for.
to, yeah, he would travel to London because he had peers over there that he
Mm-hmm.
would,
It was a lot of like his exhibition work, I think, is what took him there as well.
yeah. But including Degas that did a lot of traveling, there's a lot of suspects that were around in England that would travel to the United States and then back to England.
Mm-hmm.
So being travel probably was a lot easier to stow away and get away with a ticket, or even going over there for work.
I mean, I don't
So
think you
who
had
says
to.
that?
I don't think you had to sign your name when you bought a ticket.
No,
And you
I think
probably didn't. I
probably
mean, I
not.
think now we have to show passport, we have to show
No,
ID,
you don't have
you
to do
have
any
to,
of
Yeah.
that.
go through background checks. Your face gets scanned at the airport. Like, there's.
So who's to say that Jack the Ripper is even English?
There's nothing to
He
say.
could be American.
Well, and realistically, I
Mm-hmm.
mean, I don't know about how good the train system was back then, but I had some childhood family friends who moved to the Seattle area from the UK when I was younger, and when they moved back, the dads worked for an airline company that was partnering with Boeing, and which is what took them out here. But when they moved back, they lived just outside of London, and the dads commuted into like France or Germany by like subway every day, and it was like a 30-minute ride. I mean, so I'm assuming even without that, trains could get you into different countries within a span of a couple hours.
Yeah, like even nowadays, if we want to, a lot of people tell me like it's expensive to get over Europe, but once you're over at Europe, everything is like a 30-minute flight
Yeah.
away, or hour flight, or it's $70 to fly from England to Spain. I don't know if that's how it is still, but it's super cheap, super quick, because in America we live in a huge country that especially where we live, to get from one side of the state to the other state, from the coast to Idaho, let's say, because we live in Washington, it takes a good like 7-8 hours.
Yeah.
That's like traveling from one end of Europe to almost the other end.
True.
Yeah.
And plus our transit system isn't anywhere near as efficient as they are over there. So I can only imagine that back in the day, transit was probably a lot uh having less avenues to go through, was probably a lot smoother to get from one place to another. If you wanted to go to England from America, you just jump on the boat and get over there.
Well, and
And vice
also
versa.
now, if you want to book like a train or an airline ticket or something, you have to put a credit card down. You cannot pay cash. And you think back then,
Yeah.
like cash was king. And so, you also had no way to track spending, if somebody did purchase a ticket, like there's no way to trace it.
Yeah. So it's just easy for someone to get away with something that if they want to get away with it, they could. Unless they were very messy. And it seems like Jack the Ripper, had some kind of idea of how to, you know, get himself away. He was organized, at least in that aspect.
Yeah.
Rick, do you have any crazy theories about Jack the Ripper?
So, reading through all the killings and everything, and reading through like some of the more famous people like Mr. Lewis Carroll is even implicated
Yes.
Oh
in
wow.
these killings. But
Yes.
I I honestly believe that Jack the Ripper is not one person. I think it's a group of people
Even the
that had an agenda,
you mean
and I don't.
the canonical five are different people as well.
Um, I believe that could be one person,
Okay.
but I'm just thinking back in the day, you still had to have some kind of, way to get around the city,
Mm-hmm.
a way to cover up these things. Um, I believe Jack the Ripper might have been someone of law enforcement. And as we've seen in the past, some law enforcement people could be very have a strong dislike towards a certain persuasion of people.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe the group that I believe might have been doing the Jack the Ripper killings didn't really like prostitution much. Whereas, it could have been something like I know one of the suspects that was implicated was he was the husband of one of Jack the Ripper's, you know, uh, victims, and he was implicated because I believe in the past, if I haven't get this wrong, is that he had murdered someone in the past as well. And so it just makes me think that, this group of people wanted to drive out prostitution, possibly immigrants and others out of that area, possibly because they were from that area. You never knew. And it messed up, the town that they're from and messed everything up. It's messing up their country. Who's going to say that's not going to spread throughout the whole country? So I believe that it was all done as a scare tactic. And since possibly tactic wasn't working as much as they believed it worked, possibly dwindled it down a bit. Or possibly the outside detectives that they brought in were getting a little too close to them.
And it does make sense in the regard to we brought up earlier about Jekyll and Hyde being premiering on West End in 1886, and these murders started in 1888. So if it was like an inside, like let's say government or like law enforcement job, they could have even funded this production and been like, hey, let's get this propaganda out here, start scaring people. The play doesn't do enough, so now let's bring it to life on the street.
Yeah, yeah, I could totally see that. But then another one that I could see if you wanted to go with like an actual theory that people talk about is I can see the Prince Albert one being very you know something that could be true. It could that he had a kid with a prostitute and they were trying to cover up him having a kid.
Right, and I know they talk about the uterus being removed as part of
Yeah,
that, and it's always debated like which one was the one, right?
yeah,
But
yeah,
again, William Gohl being the royal surgeon, he's usually
yeah.
the one they point to.
Because you got to think about it is maybe Prince Albert wasn't the actual killer himself. Maybe he's like, oh, I got this prostitute pregnant. It's this person that looks like this. And so, the royal surgeon would go out and do all this. And so it makes you think, is that really what they were trying to do, or is it something else?
Well, and
I have no clue.
somebody of privilege too. You think about like, um, we look at like something modern like Epstein's Island and how
Yeah.
well that was covered and how, young women were being exploited. And you think in those cases, if he had like gotten any of them knocked up, we know that that would be taken care of,
Yeah.
essentially. So who knows, maybe he would, had a hard time keeping it in his pants, and maybe all of these women were people he slept with, and each one of them had to be exterminated in turn.
Yeah.
Maybe after the
And
first one, it was like, we're not fucking around. Like, you fuck one of them, they're dead. They're gone.
yeah. And who's to say that, like I said, that maybe Prince Albert wasn't the main person, maybe he had the surgeon do it. you know, who's to say that it wasn't a group thing that was going on?
Yeah.
You know, Prince Albert got a few of his things, off. Surgeon did a little thing to make sure that things happen. Maybe, for example, Prince Albert was into choking, and he choked them out. That's why there's deep slashes on the neck. You can't tell if they were choked out.
Mm.
That's a good point. I mean, you wouldn't, and they do even say in the early days of Ripper, like some of the non-canonical cases when they were strangled, the difference between some of the earlier and then the woman who was hanging is that
Yeah.
they were all manual strangulation. So
Yeah. So who's to say that that wasn't something that he got his rocks off to, or whatever they say.
yeah,
Um, but yeah, those are the two big ones that I'd say that I believe. The Lewis Carroll one was kind of like whatever. With the whole idea that he wrote in his diary, and every time that there was a killing, he wrote in a different
Black
color.
ink. Yeah.
Yeah, black ink instead of purple.
Yeah. It's like,
It's like whatever. Who's to say that that wasn't a sad day for him if he lived in the
yeah,
town? He's
he
like,
was like,
oh, I'm gonna
God, okay.
yeah,
Yeah,
you know,
some guy was like saying there's some weird cipher within his work, and
yeah,
then someone used it to say like I did the O.J. Simpson killings, like they
yeah. I
extrapolated that.
incriminated OJ. That's what
Yeah,
it was.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. And
yeah,
so they were like, yeah, it's
yeah.
meaningless.
damn.
Yeah, there's a bunch of like anagrams and like ciphers that he wrote to on Lewis Carroll's, like, I think, books, that he's like, this shows that Lewis Carroll's the killer. And for example, even the Prince Albert one, it was it was the author that made it up. I believe either the person he got it from, um,
Confessed.
said
Yeah,
it was a
it was
hoax,
a
that
hoax.
he
Yeah,
made it up himself. So,
it's the Gable
uh,
film all over again.
Well,
exactly.
and another thing too is if it is a team effort, any one of these theories that could make sense. Because even if it was Degas, if Sickert was doing some of these paintings, who's to say it wasn't a team effort?
Well,
Yeah.
yeah, I almost thought about that. Is that fan fiction? What if the group of guys was Sickert and Degas, and they were doing some Dorian Gray shit, and they just decided what would happen if we just shoved this, up there, and then one, Degas or Sickert, maybe Degas decided to keep going,
And we know some artists.
Yeah.
I mean, you think about
and Sickert,
tortured artists
yeah.
and the extremes that they'll go to for their work, be it however
Yeah.
psychologically damaging that may be. This has been a trend throughout time and history, is that some artists believe like we need to go to the most dark and garish places in order to
Yeah.
produce worthy art.
There's even some artists that I know personally that almost want to get themselves depressed because they write better when they're depressed.
All
you
right,
know?
Rick, you don't have to call me out. No, I'm fine.
What?
I'm calling myself out. I mean,
No, I know. He's like, you're really gonna like. Rick's like, you're really gonna like this script. I got myself so depressed when I was writing it.
Yeah. I was already hitting the bottle a little harder than usual.
Yes.
You're gonna like it.
Stop paying my bills. On the verge of being evicted.
Well,
But
I think since we don't have Brandon here, if we have any final thoughts, let's share them now. But if not, we will end part one, or
Yeah.
the Jack the Ripper episode, and then we may follow it up with some other stuff. Like,
yeah, because there's a lot more that we could
there's a lot.
talk about with this subject.
Oh yeah.
Plus the torso
I think
murders.
Yeah.
Because
We'd even like touch on like the zeitgeist of it, like what it's like inspired through like art. We just talked about maybe Degas and maybe Sickert and maybe
Albert.
blanking on the terms, the Yorkshire Ripper and
Mhm.
Others. We barely even touched on a bunch of books and people that I think they call themselves ripperologists.
Yeah.
Because they're so like in tune with the murders and research them. They're like these what are they called, like amateur detectives that look through everything and try to come up with their own theories. We've talked about a few of them, like the Albert and the Lewis Carroll, but there's so much more.
Oh yeah.
Well, I think this is the obviously, like, our minds are curious. Like, we we as human beings, we have this curiosity for knowledge, and it's a very positive thing, but it can go out of control. And sometimes when you obsess over something that will never be solved, you spend all this time just thinking on these terrible things and wanting to know the truth, and it just sucks years of your life away. I'm sure some of these ripperologists are lovely people, and I'd love to have you on the podcast, but
Yeah. Yeah. So, but I think with that, I think all we can say is be prepared for the next episode.
mm-hmm.
Part 2 or wherever we go into. Josiah, do you have any last things you want to say before we call it good?
No, I just want to say thank you so much, Katie, for being our first guest
Yes,
on the
thank
Fictitious
you, Katie, for
Dark.
adding a little class and a little femininity to the podcast.
Thank you. It's been my pleasure.
It's very nice. We spent all this time talking about sirens, and we're just like, 3 guys going like, this is really about like how you can't trust women. So, no.
Yeah.
What?
Yeah.
So thank you so
Well,
much. Thank you, Rick, for joining me yet again on this episode of the Fictitious Dark on Jack the Ripper.
Thank you, Josiah.
Absolutely. Everyone, if you enjoyed this, please like, subscribe, share the video around to your favorite subreddits.
Please do.
And please share us your crazy Jack the Ripper theory, and we might bring it up on the next time we have a podcast in general. We're always looking to expand our vast knowledge. So, everyone, good night, and sleep well out there.